The last thing Sergeant Mara Voss remembered, before the portal swallowed her, was the smell of burning plastic and the sound of Dmitri laughing. He always laughed at the wrong moment. That was his whole thing. Mortars going off 300 meters out, and Dmitri would crack a joke about the canteen food. Voss used to tell him it was a coping mechanism. He'd tell her she needed to lighten up. They'd been going back and forth like that since the academy, and now he was 3 months in the ground on a ridge outside Castellan Station, and she was somewhere else. The portal deposited her hard onto a metal grate. Her knees took the impact and she bit back a sound that wasn't quite a curse, wasn't quite a prayer. She lay there for 2 full seconds, counting her heartbeats the way her first instructor had taught her. If you can count, you're not dead, and if you're not dead, you can still fight. 1, 2, 3, she got up. The chamber was enormous. She'd expected alien architecture to look strange. All curves and organic geometry, the kind of thing the xenosociologists drew in their briefing slides back at command. What she hadn't expected was how corporate it looked. Clean white panels, recessed lighting that pulsed in slow respiratory rhythms, a smell like ozone and disinfectant, like the inside of a hospital that had been scrubbed so thoroughly it had forgotten it was supposed to be for healing. And everywhere, screens. Dozens of them, mounted at intervals along the walls, each displaying scrolling text in a script she didn't recognize, interspersed with schematics and what looked like surveillance feeds. Mara turned slowly, cataloging. One of the feeds showed the surface of Earth as seen from orbit. Her Earth, the green-brown curve of the Pacific coast, the Terminator line between day and night arcing across the hemisphere like a scar. Another showed something she couldn't identify. A structure the size of a city, mostly subterranean, its towers bristling with antennae and sensor arrays. The third screen she looked at was showing her. Not her specifically, a recording or a projection, but a human woman who moved with the same kind of stripped-down efficiency Mara had spent 12 years trying to cultivate. Short dark hair, eyes that hadn't slept enough in a long time. She was addressing an audience, and even without translation Mara could read the urgency in her posture. "Get out," the woman's body said, even as her mouth moved in words Mara couldn't parse. "Whatever you've been told about this place, it's a lie. Get out while you still can." Then a hand emerged from the edge of the frame, and the feed cut to static. Mara filed that image away somewhere deep and kept moving. She'd been briefed on the collective before the mission. Everyone in the Resistance got the same briefing, delivered by rotating instructors who all shared the same vocabulary of understatement. The collective were an interstellar federation. Emphasis on federation. They were very specific about that word, who had made first contact with Earth 14 months ago. The contact had gone badly. Contact usually did. Mara had read enough history to know that when one civilization shows up in another's backyard with better technology and a list of improvements they'd like to make, the math tends to end the same way, regardless of which species is doing the arithmetic. The collective's technology was not just better. It was different in the way that made humans feel like they were trying to understand a symphony through a wall. You could hear the bass notes, sense the shape of something, but the specifics were lost in vibration and distance. Their hegemony units, the Resistance called them hegemons, because the official collective designation was 32 syllables of clicking consonants, were constructed from a compound that behaved like metal when inert and like water when energized. They could reshape themselves, flow through openings, absorb low-caliber rounds and reconstitute before the shooter had reloaded. The Resistance's standard engagement protocol for hegemons: fallback, delay, redirect. The Resistance's actual engagement protocol for hegemons: run. Mara had not planned to end up inside the collective's primary command node on Earth with no backup and a sidearm with 11 rounds. But the portal had been unscheduled. The team's point man had triggered it before anyone understood what it was. And then the shockwave had hit, and she'd been the only one left standing close enough to the threshold. She was here now. That was the situation. She'd work with it. The first hegemon she saw was standing at a junction in the corridor, its back to her. They didn't stand the way humans stood. They maintained a static configuration that suggested standing the way a puddle of mercury suggests a sphere. Technically accurate, held in place by continuous effort rather than structure. This one was approximately 2 meters tall, pale silver, its surface texture somewhere between brushed aluminum and skin. It was interfacing with a data terminal, which meant its upper body was partially dissolved into the access port, rippling at the edges. Mara pressed herself into a recess and breathed through her nose. The collective used hegemons for security the same way humans used cameras. Ubiquitous, semi-autonomous, mostly not paying attention. Their processing bandwidth was allocated to the command network, not individual threat assessment, which meant a lone human moving carefully and quietly was, statistically, beneath notice. She moved past the junction while the hegemon's attention was subsumed in whatever data it was processing. She didn't run. She walked at the pace of someone who was supposed to be there. Dimitri had taught her that trick, actually. Walk like you belong anywhere, and people assume you do. She'd told him it didn't work with aliens. He'd said you haven't tried hard enough. She was starting to think he might have been right. The elevator was where the briefing materials said it would be. The Resistance had been working with partial schematics of the command node for 6 months, assembled from intercepted communications, and the testimony of the 3 soldiers who'd made it back from the first incursion. The layout matched well enough. The elevator was here. The central core would be below. She rode down in silence, watching her own face in the reflective surface of the doors. She looked bad. She'd looked worse. Her left ear was still ringing from the shockwave. There was blood on her collar that she was fairly sure wasn't hers, but wasn't entirely certain. She thought about the woman on the screen. Get out while you still can. Mara wasn't here to get out. She was here because the Resistance's analyst had determined that the command node housed something they were calling a nexus. A central coordination system that processed and distributed orders to collective forces in a 40,000-kilometer radius. Take out the nexus and you didn't just disrupt local operations. You created a blind spot. A gap in the network through which human forces could move, communicate, regroup. You didn't win the war, but you stopped losing it for long enough to matter. The elevator descended. Mara checked her weapon, 11 rounds. She thought about how many hegemons were likely between her and the nexus. She thought about the conversion rate of rounds to operational hegemons, which was approximately 0, since standard ammunition didn't do much against reconstituting liquid metal. She thought about what the Resistance's head of special operations, a compact, intense woman named Carver, had said in the final briefing before the team shipped out. "You're not going there to fight them," Carver had said. "You're going there to think like them." The collective builds systems to be elegant, efficient. They have no conception of a solution that is ugly and improvised and held together with spite, because in their evolutionary history, there was never any survival advantage in spite. That's our advantage. When you get there, look for the thing they haven't bothered to protect, because they can't imagine something as messy and irrational as a human being trying to use it. The doors opened. The central core was beautiful. Mara hated that she thought that. She stood at the threshold and made herself catalog the emotion and set it aside. And even then, some part of her kept whispering beautiful because there was no other word for it. The space was cathedral huge, a sphere perhaps 200 meters across, and at its center hung a structure that she didn't have proper language for. The closest analog was a chandelier, except this one was 50 meters tall and constantly in motion, its components cycling through configurations too complex to track, each element connected to the others by filaments of light that pulsed in the same slow respiratory rhythm as the ceiling panels above. The nexus round, arranged in a ring at the chamber's equator, were 12 hegemons, not interfacing, not distracted, standing guard in the full sense of the phrase, their surfaces bright and tensed, their attention, if that was the right word, directed outward. They were expecting something. Maybe they'd been told a human might come. Maybe they hadn't been told and they just knew. The way the collective seemed to always know things, through whatever collective awareness hummed along the network that connected them. Either way, 12 hegemons, 11 rounds. Mara crouched at the threshold and looked at the room and thought, the thing they haven't bothered to protect. She looked at the filaments. The light pulsed inward toward the core every 2.3 seconds. She counted 3 cycles, 2.3, 2.3, 2.3, consistent, regulatory. The nexus drew from its connection points on a fixed cycle like a heart. She looked at the floor. The chamber's surface, unlike the corridors above, was not polished metal. It was composite, a dark, dense material she recognized from the briefing files as phasic substrate, the foundation layer the collective used for complex construction, inert by default, activated by the right energy signature. The collective's engineers had built the floor of their most critical chamber out of material that, when energized the wrong way, became unstable, Mara thought. They hadn't bothered to protect it because it had never occurred to them that someone might think of it. To protect something, you have to first imagine its vulnerability. Imagination was not their strength. It was humanity's entire curriculum. She looked at the Nexus's connection points, where the filaments anchored to the walls. The energy cycling through them was regulated by the system's own safety protocols. The collective was meticulous about overload prevention, which meant the only way to force an overload was to introduce an external variable the safety protocols didn't account for. Like a seat arm with a frequency variable output setting, the kind of experimental kit that Resistance Quartermaster had issued with a shrug, and the words, "We don't actually know what it does to their stuff." Mara pulled the weapon and cycled the output dial to maximum variance. She thought about Dimitri. She thought about Carver saying, "Look for the thing they haven't bothered to protect." She thought about the woman on the screen, with the eyes that hadn't slept, and the posture that said, "Get out." She thought, "I'm not getting out." She stepped into the chamber. The hegemons noticed her immediately. She'd expected that. What she hadn't expected was the response. Not the surge forward she'd anticipated, but a stillness. A collective pause that lasted perhaps 1 second and felt longer. They were processing, communicating through the network. Deciding in the distributed and inhuman way they decided things what she was. A human, alone, one weapon, inside the most secure location on this hemisphere. She wondered what category that fell into for them, mistake maybe, or aberration. Something so far outside the probability space they'd mapped for this situation that their response protocols needed a moment to catch up. 1 second was a gift. She raised the weapon and fired. Not at the hegemons, but at the nearest connection point, where the filament of light anchored to the wall 3 meters above the floor. The round hit with a sound like a guitar string snapping. The filament flickered. The nexus above shifted its cycling rhythm fractionally, 2.4 seconds, 2.5. The hegemons moved. Mara was already running, keeping low, cutting laterally across the chamber toward the next connection point. The hegemons were fast. Faster than humans. Faster than she'd known from the briefing files, which had been assembled from footage of ground-level engagements where they were holding back. Here they weren't holding back. Here they were closing the distance with the smooth, liquid inevitability of water finding a drain. She fired at the second connection point, without stopping, without aiming properly, trusting the variance output to do something even if the shot wasn't clean. The filament shattered. The nexus pulsed and reorganized, dropping to a 2.8 cycle. 2 connection points down, 10 to go. 8 hegemons between her and the next closest one, flowing across the chamber floor with their surfaces bright and lethal. This was the part she hadn't told anyone about. The part she'd worked out in the silence of her own head in the hours before shipping out, sitting in the dark listening to the camp breathe around her. She wasn't going to make it to all 12 connection points. The math didn't work. She'd known that before she stepped through the portal. What she'd also known, she didn't need to reach all 12. She just needed to destabilize the system enough that the safety protocols, the collective's own elegant, meticulous safety protocols, would kick in and do the rest. A system built for perfect efficiency, encountering an inefficiency it hadn't planned for, would first try to compensate, then overcorrect, then cascade. They'd built a system so elegant that its failure mode was catastrophic. She fired a 3rd time. The nearest hegemon took the round in its shoulder. She'd been aiming for the connection point, but the shot went wide. And the round didn't stop it, because of course it didn't. But the frequency variance did something. The hegemon's surface rippled and it broke stride, its reformation taking an extra half-second. And that half-second was the difference between it closing the distance and Mara ducking under its reach and continuing her run. The nexus was losing rhythm, 2.9, 3.1. The filaments were compensating, drawing harder from their anchor points, and she could see the phasic substrate in the floor beginning to respond. Hairline variations in its surface. The compound activating in patches, reaching toward the energy differential. 9 rounds left, 10 connection points, she thought. Dimitri would find this hilarious, she thought. Run. She didn't make it to 10 connection points. She made it to 6. 6 was enough. The Nexus tried to redistribute load across the remaining intact anchors. The safety protocols responded to the irregular cycling by throttling input. Elegant, automatic, exactly as designed. The throttle created a pressure differential. The pressure differential energized the phasic substrate in 3 expanding rings that spread from the disrupted connection points, meeting in the middle at a frequency that the substrate's inert configuration had never been intended to handle. Mara was flat on the chamber floor with her arms over her head when the first detonation hit. The substrate didn't explode in the traditional sense. There was no fire, no shrapnel. It failed in the same way the collective built things. Precisely, systematically, each component transmitting its failure to the next with perfect fidelity. The effect, however, was catastrophic in a way that would have looked very familiar to any demolitions engineer who worked with controlled implosions. The chamber didn't come down. It folded. In the instant before the secondary cascade hit, Mara pressed her forehead against the floor and hummed 3 bars of something her mother used to sing. She couldn't have told you why. It was the kind of irrational human thing that just happens sometimes, and she'd long since stopped apologizing for it. The shockwave hit like a wall. She came to in a corridor she didn't recognize, 30 meters from the central chamber. The ringing in her left ear had graduated to a sustained tone. Her hands were intact, which she checked first, because you always checked your hands. The sidearm was still in her grip, 2 rounds left. From somewhere behind her, deep in the facility's structural bones, something was still happening. Cascade failures propagated differently in collective architecture. Not one sudden collapse, but a sequence of them, each event triggering the next, working through the system like a message being passed down a line. She could feel it more than hear it. A series of deep, irregular pulses coming up through the floor. The facility's lights had shifted from their usual pale white to something darker, a deep amber that suggested emergency protocols. She thought, the nexus is down. She thought, now get out. She found the elevator still functional. The facility was losing systems sector by sector, not all at once, and wrote it up in amber light, watching her reflection. She looked worse than before. Her right eye had swollen partially shut from something she didn't remember happening. There were new burns on her jacket sleeve, small ones, the kind you got from proximity to energy discharge. The woman on the screen, she thought. Get out while you still can. She'd made it to the floor above the central core. She needed to make it to the surface. The briefing files had a secondary extraction point on the facility's eastern edge. An access shaft the Resistance's infiltration specialists had mapped and designated Route Kilo 7. She started moving. She passed 3 hegemons in the corridors above, and all 3 of them ignored her. That stopped her cold. She pressed into an alcove and watched a hegemon flow past 2 meters away. Its surface dim and disordered, its movement pattern erratic, like a person walking after a concussion, like something trying to maintain function after losing a piece of itself. The Nexus wasn't just a coordination system, it was their anchor. It kept them synchronized, processed their decisions, maintained the coherence of the distributed intelligence that ran through each of them. Without it, they were still present, still physical, still able to function individually. But the collective awareness that made them a unified force, that was gone, or damaged, or trying desperately to reconstitute around something that no longer existed. Mara thought about what it felt like to lose Dimitri, and then she stopped thinking about it because this wasn't that and she didn't have time. She walked past the hegemons without hiding. They didn't stop her, she thought. Carver was right. Find the thing they haven't imagined. They hadn't imagined an enemy who moved through their damaged network like she belonged there. Because the concept of belonging as a tactical tool was not something they had a framework for. A human soldier who survived long enough to see the enemy's coordination system fail would, in their probability space, do one of 2 things: retreat or be eliminated. They hadn't put walk calmly through a disordered facility toward an exit on their list of human behaviors. She filed that away for the debrief. Assuming there was a debrief. Route Kilo 7 was a maintenance shaft 3 meters wide and 40 meters long, opening onto the facility's exterior through a junction designed for equipment transfer rather than personnel movement. Mara made it to the shaft in 9 minutes. She made it to the exterior junction in 11. The junction's lock was a collective design. No keypad, no visible mechanism, just a smooth surface that the briefing files said responded to the energy signature of authorized personnel. She was not authorized personnel. She looked at the lock for 4 seconds. She thought about the way the hegemon had dissolved into the data terminal upstairs. She thought about frequency variance. She thought about the 2 remaining rounds in her weapon and what her current need-to-task ratio was. She pressed the barrel of the sidearm against the lock's surface, angled it, and fired. The variance output did something to the lock's signature. The junction opened. 1 round left. Outside late afternoon. The sun low, the shadows long, the air smelling like exhaust and turned earth and the specific burning metal smell that had become synonymous with collective occupation. She stood at the facility's exterior wall, and breathed it, and tried to remember if she'd ever thought it would go this far. She couldn't remember a time she hadn't thought it would. In the distance, to the east, she could hear firing. Resistance forces were operating. She'd known they would be, timed to create a diversion while the infiltration team went in through the portal. Except the infiltration team was now one person, and the diversion was still running, because no one knew to call it off. She started moving east, through rubble, through the long shadows, through a city that had been something else before and was now this. She thought about the woman on the screen. Get out while you still can, she thought. I'm trying. The resistance position was in a ruined commercial building, 2 kilometers from the facility. Mara was challenged 3 times on her approach and gave the correct response each time, which was a series of hand signals that resistance field doctrine had changed 6 weeks ago, and which she had memorized in a bathroom outside the briefing room while Carver was still talking. The soldier who let her through the final checkpoint was 18 years old and had the expression of someone who had been 28 for approximately the last 6 months. He looked at her jacket, her swollen eye, the single-round weapon she was still carrying. Heard some noise from the facility, he said. Yeah, she said. The others? She looked at him. It was just me. He didn't ask anything else. He led her to the operations room, which was a cleared section of the building's 2nd floor, with a wall of equipment that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts across 3 generations of human technology. Carver was there, as she always seemed to be wherever the difficult situation was. Carver looked at Mara for a long moment. Then she said, "Tell me." "The nexus is down," Mara said. "Cascade failure. I used the phasic substrate against itself, fed the disruption back through the anchor points. The safety protocols did the rest." Carver was quiet. Behind her, a technician had pulled up a monitoring display and was pointing at something with an expression that was working very hard not to be excitement. "The network is fragmenting," the technician said. "Across the full coverage radius, we're seeing independent hegemon units going unresponsive to coordinated commands. Local level function retained, but the distributed intelligence is." He paused. "It's like they're each trying to remember something they've forgotten." Carver didn't look at the display. She kept looking at Mara. "1 soldier," she said. "1 soldier," Mara confirmed. 11 rounds. 1 left. Carver made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "What gave you the phasic substrate idea?" Mara thought about it. "They built the floor of their most important room out of a material that fails catastrophically under the wrong energy input. I think they did it because it gave them better structural integration." Elegant solution. "The flaw was obvious once I was standing on it." "Obvious to you?" "Yeah, because you were looking for it. You told me to." Carver turned to the technician. "Start broadcasting the network disruption data to all regional commands. Tell them the window is open." She turned back to Mara. "You need medical." "I need to know if it held," Mara said. "Before I go anywhere." The technician checked his display, checked it again. "The Nexus facility is registering complete structural failure in the central core. Secondary systems are still up, but the coordination network is." He shook his head. "It's gone, at least in this region." Mara nodded. 40,000 kilometers, Carver said quietly. Not quite to Mara, not quite to herself. "Coverage radius, 1 soldier." "It's not a win," Mara said. "No, it's a gap. Resistance forces have movement and communication for however long we need to use it," Carver said. "Yes, I know. It's not a win." A pause. "It's also not nothing." Mara went to find medical. The doctor, she was 26 and had been a resident in orthopedics before everything changed, worked on Mara's eye without speaking for a while. Outside the window, the city was doing what cities under occupation did. Existing, persistent, inconvenient, stubbornly, ridiculously alive despite everything the collective had done and was still doing. "I'm going to ask you a stupid question," the doctor said. "Go ahead. Were you scared?" Mara thought about the chamber, the hegemons moving across the floor, the nexus pulsing above, the floor activating under her. 12 against 1, and the one had a frequency variable sidearm and 11 rounds, and an idea that she hadn't fully worked out yet when she was already moving. "The whole time," she said. "Doesn't show. I've had practice." The doctor finished her work in silence. Through the window, the sun was dropping below the ruined skyline, and the amber of the collective's emergency lighting was still visible in the eastern distance, a dim glow against the dusk, fading. Mara watched it fade. She thought about Dmitri. She let herself think about him for 30 seconds, which was all she could afford. She thought, he would have been terrible in that chamber. He would have made a noise at exactly the wrong moment and gotten them both killed. He also would have come up with the phasic substrate idea 3 minutes faster than she had, because he always saw the lateral angle first. She thought, I'll figure this out without him. I already am. She thought, that's the whole thing, isn't it? That's the whole human trick. We figure it out without the people we lose. We find the ugly, improvised solution and hold it together with spite and forward motion. We walk through the enemy's house like we belong there because we've learned that belonging is a thing you perform until it becomes true. The collective had distributed intelligence. They had perfect coordination. They had technology that made human engineering look like children playing with rocks. They had never lost anyone they couldn't reconstitute. That, Mara thought, was the gap, not the 40,000-kilometer network dead zone, not the cascade failure she'd engineered in their central core. The real gap was older than this war. It was the difference between a species that had been forged in grief and one that had never had to be. Grief was the curriculum. Spite was the methodology. Stubbornness was the strategy. She was human. She had all three in abundance. She got up, thanked the doctor, and went to find Carver. There was work to do. 3 weeks later, a collective communication was intercepted and translated by the Resistance's cryptography division. It was addressed to whatever remained of the command network in the affected region. A dispatch from the collective's central authority, thousands of light years away, passing judgment on what had happened. The translation was rough, full of approximations and flagged uncertainties, the way all translations of collective communications were. But the central meaning was clear enough to the team of analysts who read it, and clear enough to Carver, who passed it to Mara without comment. The collective had a category for what Mara had done. They had a file on her, assembled from the facility's remaining sensor data, her path through the corridors, her interaction with the hegemons, the way she'd walked past 3 of them after the cascade failure without attempting concealment. The dispatch described her behavior as anomalous. It recommended increased computational resources be devoted to modeling human decision-making in high-stress environments. It noted, with what the analysts believed was the collective equivalent of bafflement, that the human had remained in the facility after the initial disruption event, rather than withdrawing, that she had apparently anticipated the cascade failure and positioned herself to survive it, that she had walked past active hegemon units in a state of network disruption without displaying distress responses. The collective's framework for understanding enemies was built on the assumption that any intelligence sophisticated enough to be a threat would behave predictably when cornered. The dispatch concluded, predictive models require revision. Mara read it twice. Then she set it down on the table in front of her and looked out the window at the city. Still there, still doing what cities do, persistent and inconvenient and alive. She thought about Dmitri. She let herself think about him for 30 seconds. She thought, tell them to build better models. Tell them to account for grief. Tell them to account for spite. Tell them to account for the thing that happens to a species when it's been knocked down enough times that getting up becomes automatic. They hadn't imagined this. They wouldn't have. You couldn't model something you'd never been shaped by. That was the advantage, not the technology, not the tactics, not the frequency variable sidearms or the brilliant cascade engineering or the courage, though she'd take all of those and hold on to them tight. The advantage was simpler and older and harder to kill than anything the collective had ever built. The collective's predictive models required revision. Good luck with that, Mara thought. She picked up the briefing materials for the next operation and got to work.